I'm happy to be joined by my friend, Eric Berkowitz. Eric is a writer, a lawyer, a journalist. For more than 20 years, he practiced intellectual property and First Amendment law and business litigation in Los Angeles as a lawyer. He has published widely throughout his career, and his writing has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Economist, LA Times, LA Weekly. His previous books include Sex and Punishment and the Boundaries of Desire. He's a resident of San Francisco. His new book just out, which I fully endorse and urge you to get a hold of, is called Dangerous Ideas, A Brief History of Censorship in the West, from the ancients to fake news. And I will just put in a disclaimer that Eric, 15, 16 years ago, was an undergraduate student of mine. He was the most mature. He just decided to retire from law and go into writing. And the fact is, I had absolutely nothing to teach him because he was already a great writer. Imagine in all those briefs and research you do as a lawyer. Anyway, Eric, thanks for joining me. It's great to see you again.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Mark.
No problem. So your book is fascinating, and what I do want to focus a lot on what this means in real life in the present. But I do want to go back in history a bit because I found it really entertaining and sort of entertaining, I guess, about how old censorship is. It seems to be as old as humanity itself. Just give us a couple examples of ancient censorship and where that was coming from and who was perpetrating it.
Well, the first example that I have has to do with the first Chinese emperor, Qin Shi Huang,
For which
I probably butchered the pronunciation of
the China's name for him, right? Emperor Xin.
Yeah. China comes from his name. Name.
Uh-huh.
He is the censor and the all-time censor. He's one of my favorites because he's so extreme. Just a short piece of background. He's the one who united the 7 kingdoms of China into one polity. Right. He's the one who started building the wall. He standardized everything.
A real wall.
More of a general than a leader. But the thing that drove him fully insane was that there was any history before him. that anyone or anything thought anything before him. And so there were Confucian scholars who were sort of sniping at him, and he would travel the kingdom in disguise and hear people sniping about him. He was hated, drove him insane. So he decided to take all books, that is all of them, except for science, kept copies of them all and burned them.
Oh.
Wanted nothing in the world that predated him or that he could be compared to badly.
That's amazing.
He also, just for good measure, took 400 or 500 Confucian scholars and buried them alive.
Okay.
So from that point forward, to discuss him in historical terms was a death crime. And what's so great about this anecdote, besides how lurid it is how it shows another theme, that censorship doesn't work. First off, the censors get censored. He lived this happened in about 213 BC.
Okay.
He lived for all of 3 years after this. He became increasingly paranoid, lived in tunnels with a sword on his lap, and became consumed like others with everlasting life, drank an elixir to live forever, and died.
Right.
Died with the terracotta army that we've seen pictures of. That's what he built. The texts survived. Confucianism survived. He died. And so he became sort of, through this process, through his paranoia, through his utter touchiness, which has stayed with authority throughout, the absolute inability to abide by any thoughts that don't jive with what you're doing right now. He only drew further attention to the text that he buried and to the scholarship, and actually gave Confucianism quite a boost for it.
Right.
So he's the beginning. And so it goes on forever. I mean, keeping with the censorship doesn't work theme, we see it throughout, that the minute something is censored, the minute an authority be it a political authority or a religious authority, trains its sight on something, the price goes up, it becomes more desirable, a black market emerges. And so, I mean, finally, the French, I can jump up ahead. Finally, the French in the 18th century stopped burning books in public because only doing so spiked sales. No?
That's pretty funny.
Yeah.
Eric,
I mean, I can go on. The examples go on forever.
When you say that censorship doesn't work, my personal inclination is, without doing any research, is to probably agree with you, because I've long argued that it seems obvious that prohibitionism doesn't work. And when, it's kind of the forbidden fruit theory that you just mentioned about the French.
Yeah.
But doesn't it work to some degree in the short run? Historically, maybe not, but to put it in brass tacks terms, can't a political regime really have some success with censorship for, 10, 20, 30 years, or not even that?
Okay, I'm going to use a $50 word here. It's an epistemological question, because there are certain things, if the texts were destroyed entirely, completely, we don't know they don't exist. Okay,
Right.
But be that as it may, yes, censorship, of course, does work often in the short run, just like terror does. Just like the presence of a platoon down the block will keep you from doing something that you might be doing. But in the long run, or even in the medium run, it really doesn't. Ideas, the book is called Dangerous Ideas,
Right,
for a reason, because it's not called Dangerous Pages. The book, the ideas on pages invariably travel much farther than the pages that they are printed on.
of course.
And so, I mean, we have a regime now in China, which, I mean, going back to China, oh, by the way, Mao loved the first emperor and said, oh, he was a piker. He killed 400 scholars. I killed 40,000. I mean, China now has, Clinton back in 92 said that when everyone was so excited about the internet being the embodiment of freedom, the answer to censorship, Clinton said that China couldn't censor anything, would be like nailing Jello to the wall. Right. Well, Clinton was entirely wrong. China has built the most comprehensive, astounding censorship machine, which, to answer your question, works in lots and lots of ways.
Yes.
I mean, when you do something on Weibo or the others, the police will actually come to your house.
Just for clarification for our folks, Weibo is the Chinese Facebook, in a sense.
It's the Chinese Twitter. Yeah.
Chinese Twitter.
Yeah. And so, for those who have the police show up to their houses, for those who lose their jobs, for those whose wives disappear, censorship works perfectly well.
Yeah.
But even in China, you and I were talking a few days ago, the Great Firewall, as it's called, is penetrated regularly and all the time. People have what's called VPNs. The group Reporters Without Borders just smuggled tens of thousands of stories into China through the online game Minecraft.
Yeah.
People have recorded news on Spotify. So,
right.
I mean, censorship will work to terrorize people. It will not keep down ideas very long.
Right. Well, I was just anecdotally, I was in China, I guess about 6 or 7 years ago, a couple of times, back to back. And it was quite interesting because, the firewall, the Great Chinese Firewall exists, and you cannot access a lot of Facebook and social media and other sites from a basic internet account in China. And I spoke rather freely, and I was talking to journalists about web journalism, and of course I had to talk a lot about what's actually on the web. Stuff they theoretically can't see.
Yeah.
After each talk, I was approached by handsful of reporters and people in the audience who wanted to share VPN information with me.
Pull their little thingies out.
Right. They knew I was a foreigner, and they wanted to know, it was clear that I was still monitoring social media, and they were just saying, did I have a better VPN than they did, right? When I was in Cuba, it was different. I was in Cuba many times. There was just no access. That's changed to a degree. but the web was basically not accessible to people. And that does create a certain blockade of ideas and literature and all that kind of
It
stuff.
does. It does.
I wanted to ask you. You argued that in the old days, whatever that means, censorship was a two-party affair for the most part. It was mostly government versus the people, and now you argue that it's three-sided. How's that?
I've actually, the funny thing about writing this book is that it keeps on growing. I think it's now four-sided.
Yeah.
Traditionally, censorship, in the way that you and I grew up, Mark, as old as we are, censorship was normally outliers. I mean, from the beginning, dissidents, artists, heretics, outliers, nosy reporters such as yourself, against authority, be it state authority. So any gains made for freedom of speech were generally made at the expense of authority. And we can see that here in the United States. I mean, what started as basically an offshoot of English professional dissent suppression, we grew and grew, and it was the famous cases, New York Times versus Sullivan and the others, which really cemented the ability to criticize the government, the ability of everybody to criticize the government. But now things have expanded, I think, in two fronts. One, we have these quasi-governmental organizations where all the show is, which are the social media platforms. So that's the third side. And that has become the public square. That is, of course, that is where most of the action is. That's where most of the exchanges are. They exist within government regulation and outside government regulation.
Right.
So that they don't exist for anyone's particular good, other than their shareholders or themselves.
Right.
And to call them a media company is true. To call them an ad company is true, but that's the third player, which I think is extremely important. And now there's, I think, a fourth side, which, just to go back for 1 second, excuse me, the social media platforms, because of the way they're set up in the United States, they're private, like a private school or a coffee shop or your house. So they're able to manage speech in ways that the government isn't allowed to.
They're not subject to the First Amendment.
Not at all. They have First Amendment rights, but they don't have to protect anyone else's First Amendment rights. So they can do the dirty work that the government can't do, which is squelch hate speech, squelch fake news. They could do whatever the hell they want. They could decide they don't like Marc Cooper anymore, and your Facebook account is shot.
Right.
Now, going into the fourth dimension, I think if the rise of cancel culture, with the rise of an informal form of censorship, which is, let's just call it the mob,
like a Twitter
online mobs.
It's a Twitter mob, right?
Twitter mobs, and not even online, on college campuses, in private organizations. And people were, every 4 days, every 2 days, we're reading about people losing their jobs, getting acceptances revoked. John Stuart Mill, of all people, 150 years ago, anticipated this. And I went back and read it. I mean, he made this great statement On Liberty, protecting even the minority opinions. His great observation is that who knows whether we're right? Who knows whether the nutcase screaming on the corner could be right? We shouldn't squelch him. But then he also said later in that same essay On Liberty that the worst censorship is social tyranny, is the tyranny of the mob, not necessarily the mob of guys carrying tiki torches, but of social
being
ostracized.
Ostracized.
And that's what we're experiencing now on a daily level, where people are saying things that are legal, they're making observations, they're making blog posts, they're doing things, and they're losing their jobs and they're losing their livelihoods. And so I think we're now in a very, very complex, fascinating, and a little scary multi-dimensional speech environment where public and private are merging, where the government is more powerful and less powerful than it's ever been, and where common people, who are always the ones who have the least power, are now gathering together and, rightly or wrongly, with or without subtlety, with or without judgment, having an effect, bullying authorities, schools, governments, to do what they want.
Eric, you um, you just referred to cancel culture, and
Yeah,
I'm going to politicize the conversation a little bit. You can go as far as or not as you please,
I love it.
but it seems to me, anecdotally, as somebody who's I'm a product of the 1960s, right? I'm a typical boomer, age 70. Uh, coming of age in the middle 1960s. Free speech, we have the free speech movement in 1964 in Berkeley, right, which really kicked off the 60s in a way. But for people my age and my cultural background, free speech was that notion of free speech was a sacred, yes, sacred,
Yeah.
right, sacred. My anecdotal impression now, and it's more than anecdotal, my impression now is that free speech has been appropriated, correctly or not, by conservatives. That people who talk most about free speech now, to be specific, are mostly Trump people, QAnon, the conservatives, the Republicans, and from the Democratic and more than Democrat, on the liberal kind of woke side, you hear people harumphing over free speech. They will not endorse free speech. They don't. And I noticed since the Republicans a few months ago picked up the slogan of cancel culture, right? Which is kind
everything now is cancel culture.
Yes, yeah. Right. It's whatever they want it to be. I've noticed, and on the left, I've noticed some websites. I'm not going to be specific. I could be, but I'm not going to be. I've noticed some people on the left now saying, "Oh, there is no cancel culture," right? Because
I'll say it. Charles Blow, the columnist from the New York Times,
liberal, African American,
very liberal, very, very smart guy, said cancel culture is a smear from the right. What actually exists is free speech. But you just made a really fascinating point.
That's not true. Go ahead.
Well, I mean, it's partially true because people can speak without getting thrown in jail for it. But there's so much missing from what Blow said that it's might as well not be true. What I've noticed, I'm a few years behind you, but not too many.
Okay.
Is the notion of freedom of speech was always wrapped with, let's call them revolutionary movements. I mean, this is something throughout that, starting in the English Revolution, into the American, French, all throughout, as people are looking to upset authority structures, part of their pitch, part of their ethos is always, let me say what I want to say, freedom of speech. And we carried that the 60s, of course, didn't happen out of nothing. I mean, we carried that whole tradition into that. And so free speech, good, bad, ugly or pretty, upsetting or affirming, profane and filthy or clean, it was all part of the ethos. And I think what has occurred, and you and I could talk about why. I don't think you and I are terribly qualified to, because it's a psychological or an anthropological thing. Is speech has gone from being an inherent good on the left to being an inherent threat. That I don't want to hear this racist. I don't want to hear this boorish character. I don't want to hear this sexist character. It hurts me. It silences me. It makes me feel intimidated. It makes me feel bad. Okay. I don't think that we're any more touchy right now than we were. I mean, when I identify very strongly with being Jewish. When I hear anti-Semitic speech, it rattles me. It hurts me. I don't feel the compulsion to then shut that person up. But somewhere along the way, we've decided that hurtful speech and offensive speech is speech that has to be stopped. And that actually, what's happening is the rest of the world is kind of like that, particularly Europe. And we're just now importing a European ethos into how we're feeling. I mean, there are hate speech laws by the barrelful in Europe, and they're getting tighter and stronger.
I know I've had many people, friends, some followers of this newsletter and others, who have in fact pointed to Germany and to France as positive examples because they say,
Oh,
well, in France or in Germany, you can't get away with being a neo-Nazi publicly. Right? You can't be, an out front racist like the Trump folks have been, some
no
of the
way.
folks, and the QAnon people are, et cetera. And our society would be so much healthier, they argue, if we could just regulate this hate speech, get rid of Nazis and others in the public sphere, suppress racist thought. And they point to Europe as an example. So it's a two-part question. Is Europe really much tougher than the United States? And two, what's wrong with that kind of view? I know that you don't share it.
That's a great question. Yes, Europe is tougher and getting tougher every minute of the day. I keep up with this stuff, and
Yeah.
every day and a half, there's a new rule getting passed either on a Europe-wide basis or on a national basis, requiring, putting the heat on platforms to pull everything off. Europe has, had a little trauma 60 odd or 70 odd years ago.
I remember. Yeah.
Which really colored everything, and they came to the collective decision that too much tolerance breeds intolerance. That if we're too tolerant, we're going to eat ourselves alive. And Germany, in particular, just as a prime example, I mean, in Germany, in the week of Charlottesville, the police were protecting actively tiki torch carrying lunatics, protecting them because that hatred in America is an idea. Hatred in Europe is an action, and that's an action to be stopped. That same week, 2 hapless Chinese tourists went in front of the Reichstag, and I think it's a joke.
Yeah.
They raised the salute, and they were picked up and thrown in jail for it.
Right.
So here's what is good about that. Well, I mean, I don't like hatred. You don't like hatred. I mean, but I think it's actually a little naive.
Yeah.
It's a little ridiculous to think that you can, by quelling the speech, you're going to quell the sentiment.
Yeah.
Prime example, in 2020, the head of the European Council issued a report showing the rise in hate crimes in Germany and throughout Europe. They're going up radically. Her answer was, we have to stop all this hate speech. And my point was, wait, what you've done is, And so I think what we do is we go back to what we think is true, and we think if we just do twice as much of it. Now, what's the upshot? Is it better? I don't think it's actually affected the level of hatred or racism or morbid self-regard that is behind the hate speech. In fact, it just drives it elsewhere to darker, nastier reaches. And I actually value speech. And so what has happened is that Germany and France have put heavy heat on the platforms to clean everything up. And that's easier said than done because there's billions of pieces of content rolling through the platforms every day. So they use machines and algorithms to do it. And that's like carpet bombing. So a lot of good speech is getting cleaned up or cleaned away with the bad. So people are getting stifled. That's not a good thing. Okay. And also Germany in Facebook had to hire like 1,300 human content moderators to meet the German law.
Really?
And they filed a class action suit because their conditions were so crazy. When you're a content moderator, all you're doing is looking at the bad shit all day.
Right.
And so a lot of them began to believe the world was flat. I'm not joking. Began to believe that the Jews killed Christ. Began to believe all these. It doesn't work. You pass these laws. Now, Britain right now is on the verge of passing again, their intentions, I think, are noble. I don't think the Brits are out to ruin things, but they're about to pass a law, an online safety bill, which not only will put heat on the platforms in the face of gargantuan fines to get rid of illegal speech, but to get rid of what they call lawful but awful speech.
Lawful but awful. Lawful but awful.
Lawful but awful. It's a great phrase.
Who decides what's awful?
Yeah, good damn question. The platforms.
The winners write history. Yeah.
We hate the platforms. We think Mark Zuckerberg is a miserable. So what do? Give them more power under threat to take more speech away. They've already proven that their judgment is poor.
Well, let me let's hover over that point for a minute, because I think that's really a very live issue here, and that's not to underestimate.
Electric.
Yeah. And for those of you who've been listening for the last 25 minutes or so, if you're so engaged in the conversation as you should be, let me remind you that Eric's book is called Dangerous Lies.
Dangerous
Ideas, a brief Dangerous Ideas, a brief history of censorship in the West from the ancients to fake news. And I'm just going to tell the readers, the followers here, that the history that you evoke is absolutely fabulous. But I'm not going to ruin it, because I want to use our time mostly to talk about the present. But for those who are listening, I really suggest the book. It's just a treasure trove of good stuff. And I have to say, without buttering you up, Eric, as your former professor, you're also a very gifted writer. And I mean that sincerely. I reread part of the book last night, and it's quite impressive. Just your mastery of the language is impressive.
Thank you.
You're welcome, and and I mean it, every word of it. So let's talk. You brought it up, so I'm going to stick it to you. Let's do a little exercise here, okay? Let's pretend that because you've written this book, right, you've now been called as an expert witness before the U.S. Congress, where there are currently, as we sit here today, all kinds of proposals and ideas about how to regulate Facebook and social media. What's your view on this? Should we regulate Facebook and make Mark Zuckerberg, get rid of more of this hate speech, or is that just giving him more power?
Well, I would probably approach Congress. The first thing I would do is, get one of the ties, which is covered in dust at this point, and I would remind Congress that rules against hate speech and even fake news are invariably used around the world for the exact opposite reason. Hate speech laws are proliferating everywhere, and you know what they're used for? To quell dissent.
Of course.
They were also used against Gandhi, thrown in jail for hate speech. Mandela, thrown in jail for hate speech. So beware any law that governs speech, okay? Because just two words, Donald Trump, what would he do with a law like this? And fake news laws, I would remind Congress, are used almost invariably to perpetuate lies, particularly over COVID. So I would try and orient the intention of trying to do the right thing from the inevitable result that we create monsters. Okay, and you create a monster when you give power over speech to people who are affected by it, that is governments. But then going into whether we should regulate Facebook at all, we have a pesky problem, and that's the First Amendment.
Right.
And the way the First Amendment, and I don't consider it a problem, I was being sarcastic, but
right.
the way the First Amendment has developed in the last 70 odd years is that it's almost absolute. Okay, I mean that unless you're Trump in front of a crowd saying, go to the Capitol that way, I'll follow you. I mean, I found that to be inciting, but unless it's that crystalline, at least in the political level, you're clean. I mean, I could stand on, and so any rule that would lean on Facebook and Twitter to address certain viewpoints or to take certain speech out or leave certain speech in, it sounds nice, but you're going to lose in court. The First Amendment. So we can go through this exercise where Senator, where you're going to appeal to your constituents and saying, I'm going to get the bad stuff off, but in 3 years, it's going to be back in front of your desk because you're going to lose. What I would suggest, and you and I talked about this even more deeply, and I think would be the safest, is you get the platforms where they breathe. there's always been hatred. There's always been lies. We've been bathing in bullshit from the government, for decades. We can't forget that the Iraq War was started over a lie over, weapons of mass destruction, amplified by the New York Times. So all of this stuff isn't new. But what I would suggest is the real sin, if you will, of the platforms is the sucking of our private data from every little thing we do, every place we go, every confession we make into these weird apps that we talk about, every place, that all creates profiles which are used to target ads for us. And that created the ecosystem of the amplification of the we aren't speakers online, we're users. We're all working for Zuckerberg, okay? So every dispute, it's the truth.
I know.
Every dispute, every spat, every stupid thing keeps us on platform, keeps us agitated, and keeps ads going for us. The way to clean up the ecosystem is not to address speech itself. That will lose, and I think it's immoral, but to get the actual, let's call it the setup.
Right.
And I think that would have the best chance of winning because you're not really dealing with speech. We can regulate advertising much more safely.
Right.
And, Zuckerberg would be worth 2 million rather than 9.
Right. Well, it seems. I think that's a great idea. I don't know if
It's the only one that I could think of that would actually work.
Correct.
There are some others, but
But in terms of though our current moment, and when I say current, I don't mean today, but I mean broadly speaking, Facebook isn't social media, as you point out, is not. It's the third player in a 4-player quartet, right? Because what I understand from your analysis of this fourth player in censorship, we're not talking about institutions. We're talking about people who use social media, but it's coming from individuals and groups who are trying to quash, more than trying to quash speech, I'd say they're trying to quash careers. Because the speech has already happened. They're responding to speech, right? Some professor will say this or that, and then they'll get attacked by a Twitter mob, and they'll be deplatformed. They may
from the left and the right. It's not.
Absolutely.
It's not just the right who are targeted or the left. We're equal opportunity pylons.
So that brings me to this question. You and I both know that part of the mythology, and I don't mean that necessarily in a negative way, part of the narrative of this country is our supposed commitment to free speech and democracy, etc. Given that you've had the unenviable position of having to review all the history of censorship, where are we today in the United States compared against ourselves? Okay, forget about Europe, where I think we're doing better, but are we better off now than 100 years ago? And are we better off now than 10 or 20 years ago? Those are two different questions, I think.
100 years ago, just by chance.
It's a bad year.
101 or 102 years ago is when the first real, if you can believe this, the first real decisions by the Supreme Court interpreting the First Amendment came out. It was kind of an inert thing until World War I, and there was a lot of protests against the draft, and a lot of the protests were by communists and Jews and foreigners, and so the Supreme Court began to develop its ideas. The marketplace of ideas thing came out during those cases, and as they were affirming the convictions of people who were objecting to World War I, Oliver Wendell Holmes, Brandeis, the others, the colossal minds, began to actually develop the theories which led us to today. I think we're in a period right now, we may be at the tail end of it, we don't have the perspective to know, of pretty much the greatest human achievement, or one of the greatest human achievements ever, which is American society after World War II.
Right.
The speech environment, the idea that we can march against police, the idea that we can march against wars, the idea that you and I could sit and say whatever we want. The idea that Trump could get as ridiculed as he is, and he was actually in the end kind of powerless as hard as he tried. There's a lot to be grateful for, and it didn't come easily. There were a lot of lives lost. And so are we better off now than 100 years ago? Oh my God, yes. We just don't appreciate it. What astounds me is how willing and ready we are to give up what we've accomplished in the face of a short-term gain. This hurts my feelings. I don't like this. You know, my group is insulted.
I feel
Let's get rid of the First Amendment. Half of America, under surveys, believe the First Amendment is outdated. It needs to be rewritten. More than half of millennials. Now, more than half of millennials think that hate speech should be illegal. Again, I got to say, I don't like hate speech. Okay, I hate it.
But hate's
just like you do.
But hate is in the eye of the beholder, like everything else.
Of course, yeah. So it's used to squelch dissent. But by saying I want the protection of hate speech, it isn't to say that I want hatred. We have to make these distinctions. You know, Thurgood Marshall, one of the great leaders of civil rights ever, was on the Supreme Court and voted with the majority to protect a Klansman calling for his own death, because he realized that that's the Brandenburg case. It's a very famous case.
Right.
Because Marshall realized that, yes, I'm sure Marshall would have loved to have gone and hit that guy over the head with a club, but he realized that when you outlaw speech coming in one direction, it's inevitably going to be shot out in the other. And so we have to suffer for our own good. And I don't think we are ready to suffer. Are we better off than we were 10 years ago? No. I think there's actually fractures showing, pretty loud ones. Again, America has, through the side door, imported a lot of the European restrictions through terms of service. You know, everyone's pissed off at Zuckerberg and Dorsey, but they're deleting billions of pieces of speech every day. In fact, one journalist, I forgot her name, called Facebook the greatest censorship operator in the world. People are pissed off, at least from the left, that they're not doing enough. But it's softening. There are now rumblings from the right. Justice Thomas, who I detest, just filed a concurrence saying that New York Times versus Sullivan should be overturned. And
great. Wonderful.
That's the decision, just for our viewers, in case they don't know, which really cemented the ability of the press, and by extension, the citizenry, pretty much to go after the government with all you've got.
Right. And
not go to jail for it. So we're beginning to hear cracks are forming, and I'm concerned. I'm not, out of my mind concerned, but there's a shift. And as the right begins to co-opt free speech begins to take on different meanings.
Right.
Exxon has asserted a free speech defense to its lies about climate change.
Mm-hmm.
This group, Clearview, has asserted free speech to its practice of scraping our faces from Facebook and selling them to the police.
Oh, great.
Money is now speech under the Citizens United case. That was never the case. So the notion of free speech being the protection of a minority for their political views against an armed authority, I think the right's done a wonderfully effective job of co-opting an issue for, I would argue, nefarious purposes.
I understand. Eric, you've argued that, which I find fascinating, and we're going back into history a little bit.
Great.
And I'm curious if that carries over to the present, but you've argued that in censorship, when we look at censorship, class, social class, has actually been key, maybe principal in censorship. And that kind of walloped me until I thought about it, but I'll let you expound on that. How does class figure in? And does it help?
Class figures in beginning, middle, and end. Censorship I think everyone's always realized that censorship really doesn't work, that you're never really going to get rid of a text entirely. So what's happened repeatedly is that censorship is as much an effort to channel speech as it is to suppress it. And so the classic examples, are really from the 19th century, where Europe itself was racked with revolution repeatedly. Take the work of Thomas Paine.
Right.
Okay, the classic.
Right.
He wrote a book called Age of Reason, which is pretty much of a broadside against religion, top to bottom. Everyone who published that book, and a lot did, the trials, it's funny how little people hid things back then, back in the 19th century. What they basically said was, look, the gospel, religion, is for the poor. It's to keep them hoping for a better life once their horrible life now ends. And if we shake that view in religion by reading Thomas Paine, then we don't know how this is all going to go. And so, it's a classic example. Of course, what happened with these trials is it just drew attention to the works, and the sales spiked, and it kept on going. So throughout the 19th century and into the cinema, there's this preoccupation by authorities to not get the lower classes agitated or aroused sexually, because they were considered to be naturally animalistic, and we don't want to get them too done up. And so we see repeatedly, for example, books that are priced in an expensive fashion allowed, but when they're made cheap, they're not allowed. It goes on and on and on. I mean, into cinema, we see in the 19th century throughout a preoccupation with images and with plays and with caricatures, because so many people still couldn't read. And there was this mortal fear that when poor people get together in a dark place and people start talking to them, and they start getting, spoken to in ways that then that can't be. So the same plays that were put on for expensive audiences in beautiful houses were outlawed in the lower ones. Austria required at one point that the ending of King Lear be changed so the king didn't die. King Lear, for our viewers, king, he tries to give his kingdom to the daughters. It doesn't work out. Death ensues. He dies crazy. When that's put on in the royal opera houses, that was fine. But no way are the poor going to watch a king die crazy and naked. That just simply isn't going to happen.
Do you think that in the America of 2021, here's a curveball. Do you think that in America of 2021, class is still that important to censorship? I don't see it immediately.
I see a reversal. I mean, with respect to cinema, I just to finish this one thing. The first cinema laws, the censorship laws, which exploded instantly with cinema, were fully preoccupied with keeping destructive messaging away from the poor.
And right at the birth of the cinema, right?
Right at the birth of the cinema, instantly.
Right.
Forget it. And
for 100 years, basically, almost 70 years, basically.
Yeah, until the 50s when actual censorship was outlawed, but then
it was still the hate
changed.
Okay.
To answer your question, I think, to get back to cancel culture, I think there's actually been kind of a flipping of the upside down. This is a good thing, I think we could say about social media, is that it has given a voice to people who were previously voiceless. If they can make it through the algorithms, if they can negotiate their way through, people can make their voices heard. And I think what's happening a lot with cancel culture and with a lot of movements against offense is people who, and I'm going to argue the other side now, I'm a lawyer, is that people who were traditionally silenced are not feeling so silenced anymore.
Right.
So people who are feeling offense and maybe had to keep it quiet because they just didn't know their place, I say that sarcastically, or couldn't find couldn't find kindred souls are now finding kindred souls and making their voices heard. So I think there's actually kind of a reversal of class-based censorship in which the lower classes, if you will, the underrepresented classes are being heard now louder, longer than ever before. And I think that's a real preoccupation for authoritarian governments and for our government.
Well, it's an interesting. It's interesting that you make that suggestion because, as you well know, there was a lot of promise of with the emergence of the internet that there was, this was going to knock down the gatekeeper,
flatten everything. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it has to a degree, though the preoccupations in the last couple of years have run into the negative side, right? Which is, the dominance of big corporations like Facebook or big companies like Twitter or whatever, who now basically sit on top of those social media sites and have their influence. And it makes it more difficult in a way to break through, but it certainly can. The web can certainly be an effective weapon against censorship. No.
Oh yeah, of course. I mean, there's always workarounds. I think that what's happened, just to carry this idea of the underrepresented classes, the previously neglected classes, finding a voice, is there's a new form of censorship, which is speech itself.
What do you mean?
This great scholar who I admire very much at Columbia, I think he's the administration now, Tim Wu, invented the phrase cheap speech.
What's the phrase?
Cheap, as in inexpensive, cheap speech.
Okay.
That speech is nothing, it's not this precious little flower that we have to guard. It's now used in volume. So we can go back to China, and then also Trump himself, who is very adroit at mimicking those techniques. When messages are coming, the Chinese government has millions of people, literally millions of people on the payroll. It's kind of like if not Instacart, a TaskRabbit kind of thing, where they will start to flood the information ecosystem with distracting noise, with racist shit, or with, to distract attention, to drown out messaging either from the wrong place or from places that they don't want to hear, and to challenge truth itself. So I think Trump was also very adroit at that. When things would happen that would affect him or he would feel affected negatively, he and his minions and the people who followed him would call out millions of voices to start to talk about things that didn't matter anymore, or make accusations or make disputes where there really was no basis in it. So we begin to, through the sheer volume, the mobilization of volumes of speech and remarks, we begin to lose track of where's up and where's down.
I'm wondering, Eric. This is a stray thought. I'm wondering if you agree, or what your view is of this thought, that Trump, in a certain way, may have been or may be a certain kind of distraction on this issue, in the sense that he is clearly an intolerant, authoritarian, right? Who, if he had his way, he would hear nothing that contradicts anything. I mean, he'd be like Emperor Qin from China, right? I think.
Well, he'd be jailing people left and right. Yeah.
Right. And he's an easy target. I mean, it's easy to attack him. It's easy to say, "Oh God, Trump, would do this or that." Trump is no longer in power. My question is, does the polarization, I guess, around Trump distract us from other day-to-day censorship that we see coming from the other side? Coming from the other side. In other words, we have people who don't have much power, right? They're not the president. They're not easy to identify or to hate or whatever. But, if they join up with 1,000 other people on Twitter and destroy somebody's career because they said this or that, and I mean, isn't in some senses, hasn't Trump been a distraction, or has he been an accelerant? How do you place him in this broader context?
he's kind of like the O.J. Simpson murder trial, which is how everybody learned about criminal law. And I would have to say to people, like, that trial was freaky. Okay, that's not how things went. That's not how things are. It was like what O.J. got off. I mean, yes, Trump, because he was such a lunatic and such a large character, and because he became president for 4 years, which makes him less a sideshow and more actually a factor, has been a distraction. And I plead guilty to it. I mean, I would wake up for 4 years and think, what fresh hell am I facing today? And if only we got rid of him, things would work out. What he did do, though, which I think is less of a distraction and more of a lasting, is he busted away, how can I put it? The Supreme Court said in a famous case that free speech is powerful medicine for our society, even the noise, even the hurt. And part of what's the medicinal about it is that it makes us take responsibility for our own lives. It makes us take responsibility for how we function and what we say. So there are a lot of norms built into the First Amendment. Yeah, we're allowed to say a lot of things, but that doesn't mean we should, okay? There's a lot of stuff we can do that we shouldn't do. Trump busted those norms. He made hate speech a top-down, from the government thing. He busted a lot of his conduct and his use of Twitter, for example. He, in the language of the far right, he went there. So we're left with a lot of busted norms, and we're trying to figure out how to put together a civil society without this careening voice. What I think he is a distraction on, for example, and I think this is critical, and I think you're fully right on this, is there was this whole thing of whether Facebook should keep Trump on or keep him off, and they convened their own little private court of notables who they're paying a fortune to work literally 15 hours a week. That all became, I mean, Zuckerberg played that beautifully. Like, nothing to see here. I've got it covered. I've got my court, and they're giving me a hard time. Well, Trump continued, and one, they didn't give him a hard time. They punted the case. They never got to the core of it, which is how Facebook's structure itself led towards it. So individual speakers such as Trump will come and go, even him.
Right.
We're left with an ecosystem that allows a lot of, how can I put it? The marketplace of ideas now, the idea was originally that we walk into a market, we survey the ideas floating around, and we choose the ones that are true and leave the dreck to sit on the shelf. Well, the way that Facebook and Twitter and the others, for no other reason than to keep us on platform so they can make money, is the marketplace of ideas. We're shoved right to the frozen food aisle. We're shoved right to the candy counter, or right to the processed meat. So the distractions of Trump or Viktor Orban or these other misery characters that come and go, we get very fulfilled when they get their comeuppance.
Right.
But it doesn't really change much.
Right. What? Yeah. I'm just. I guess.
Does that make sense? I think it
makes total sense because.
I mean, there's like Duterte, Orban, all these characters.
Oh yeah. Well, as a journalist, what concerns me is that, fortunately, I'm basically retired, mostly retired. I don't work for anybody else. If I did, I would have to be very careful, because I know that some of my thoughts are quite unpopular now, and I would be lynched for it. I'd be Twitter mobbed for it. It's happened to friends of mine and even to family members.
My own book raised a level of danger to my British publishers.
That's what I was getting to. I was just going to gratuitously get my 2 cents in on your time and say that what concerns me is that it's the shutdown of debate that really concerns me. I mean, we now have, from where I'm at on my left-wing side, or liberal side, if you will, on the left side, generally speaking, I find that there's 4 or 5 cheap slogans that now substitute for all thought. I mean, if you're on the left now, if you don't agree that all problems stem from capital W S white supremacy, if you don't agree that that's the root of all of our problems, say as opposed to capitalism or human nature or the weather, right? Or whatever, well then you can't really say that publicly as a journalist without engaging in a lot of consequences. You may not lose.
And worse than that, you by not saying that that is the sole reason, somehow that that morphs into you actually are a racist.
You're a racist, and you're a
so
threat.
you become immoral for that.
Yeah. Well, that's the part that most scares me, because, and it scares me, frankly, it does scare me, because I'm not afraid of the state. I agree with you that having traveled all over the world, it's very difficult. It's not 100% impossible. It's very difficult to suffer, criminal reprisals for your speech in the United States. It's possible, but it's very difficult, right?
Yeah.
And I'm not worried about the police coming to my house for something I write. I'm worried about. I don't worry about it because I don't do it, because I don't work for anybody. But I would be worried about even this interview with you, to be frank, would cause problems. I wanted to ask you, I was going to ask you about the media and self-censorship, because I think on the left there's a lot of focus on that. There's a lot of kind of a I'll have to be careful here, because I sort of agree with it, but there's a kind of semi-paranoid supposition that the media is feverishly engaged in self-censorship, and I think that exists to a degree, but I think anybody with a brain can read through it. I'm not sure. But you suffered that. I don't know if it suffered, but you experienced that, ironically, even in the writing of this book with your own publisher, from what you told me.
With the stupid book that I wrote.
Tell our folks what happened to you just about your book with your own publisher who had commissioned the book.
Yeah, I mean, this book wasn't actually my idea. It was commissioned by my British publisher, who are terrific people. They have an Arabic side to them. They publish a lot of books funneled to the Middle East, and I'm part of their English language side.
Yeah.
And the woman who runs it, the publisher, is a brilliant, very cosmopolitan lady originally from Lebanon. And she called me, and we were batting around ideas, and we came up with this. And for a year and a half, she's telling me every 4 weeks, "Don't be scared. Give your thought. Do what you have to do."
Yeah, go and throw yourself off the cliff for us.
Okay. So I was writing about the Salman Rushdie situation, which the world knows enough about it, but I was like touching on it. And then talking about self-censorship, about how after the Danish cartoons and Charlie Hebdo and progression, people are pulling punches. They're not putting on plays. They're not putting on art exhibits. They're holding back, and it's documented pretty heavily.
The New York Times wouldn't publish the cartoons.
Index on Censorship wouldn't publish the cartoons.
Right.
A Yale book about the cartoon controversy wouldn't publish the cartoons.
That's amazing to me.
It's amazing, and the reason why is they were scared. Okay. And so there was a decision. So I'm writing about that, and there was a decision from the European Court of Human Rights, which is the highest court on this subject in Europe. And there was a woman in Austria who gave this, she was a provocateur, and she gave this class in which she called Muhammad, the prophet, a pedophile because of his young wife.
He did have a very young wife.
He had a very young wife. But I mean, she was being she was being obnoxious. And she was charged criminally for inciting hatred in Austria.
Really?
And lost.
Really?
And then she took it up to the European Court of Human Rights, which in 2018 ruled against her and said, in fact, I've got the quote here. It's kind of astounding. What they basically said was, look, you were being gratuitously offensive, and you were being gratuitously offensive. I'm looking for it. Yeah. And You went beyond the permissible limits of an objective debate. Who wrote that rule? Who wrote that a rule's got to be objective? Anyway,
especially in debates.
I really began to criticize the court on this. I thought they just got it completely wrong. And what they were scared of was that by allowing this speech, it would egg on the radicals who would start to throw stones and hurt people. And what I said was that by ruling against this woman, the court internalized the fatwa, which is a phrase I borrowed from another writer, for all of Europe. Well, my very brave British publisher calls me and says, Eric, I can't do it.
Your British publisher.
My British publisher cannot do it.
The one
not going to happen.
The one who asked you to do the book.
The one who asked me to do the book and was goading me.
Cancel the book. They didn't want that part about Muhammad.
They didn't want that section because I was taking too hard of a line against the people who might, object to this. And she said to me very, very honestly, she said, I have a child. Okay. I've had death threats. I have employees. It kills me. And so we have to rewrite this. And I realized that it's very easy to be a First Amendment absolutist from my townhouse in San Francisco, and much harder to be one when you're in London and you have a 12-year-old child who you're scared for. Right. And I was really taken aback, and I walked around the block about 25 times and then came back and realized that I don't live in an ivory tower. I live in an actual world, and I care about this woman and her child very much. And I self-censored, confess. We rewrote that section so that she wouldn't feel in danger. So this book about censorship, about a decision, itself became the story in a way, and astounds me still.
In full disclosure, I know this because I spoke with Eric privately before this, because we're frequently in touch. Eric, but I understand from you that the American edition, the U.S. edition of your book, right,
is intact,
not censored.
Yeah,
not censored. That's the word.
Not censored. And so I forgot the page number, but I really come after the court for what I think is an abominable decision to uphold a criminal conviction. We aren't talking about like shutting her up. We're talking about charging her for a crime for what she said about a religious leader who lived 1400 years ago. It goes too far. It's too much.
The court was being, in my biased opinion, the court was being a little too honest. They should have used the excuse that the editor of the New York Times used, Dean Baquet, saying he didn't want to upset nice Muslim families living in Brooklyn who would read this by, printing the cartoons. Of course, that was not the reason, but that was the reason he gave. It's kind of fantastic.
Yeah. I think that the court was probably, again, Europe has a different view. They value free speech, but not to the extent that it starts to pull at society itself.
Eric,
we just go for it.
Let me throw you one last
sure.
I don't know. I don't remember this being in your book, but I'm going to ask you anyway because you did the research and you may not have an answer. It's okay if you don't. Is there somewhere in the world, like, I don't know, Iceland or somewhere where, there's a real commitment to battle censorship? Is there a place that's freer than others or is aggressively, proactively free speech or not?
There's always there's an industry with NGOs and institutes. People make a lot of good livings doing reports on this. Every year there are rankings put out for, and I could be wrong.
Okay.
But somehow Finland always seems to come out on top, and it could be because there's nothing but caribou up there. But I mean,
no, I've been there. It's not that bad. It's a little.
No, I mean, it looks like I've always wanted to go. In major countries with large heterogeneous populations, I think where we're sitting is about as good as it gets, and we're tearing our hair out. But I think that's what speech is about. I don't think we could ever legislate ourselves out of social discord.
Right. Well, I think that's the big thing that I've seen change in, say, since the 1960s. While there were a lot of people in the 1960s who hated the protesters and young people like me, etc. But it was mostly ideological. It was like, well, these people are not real patriots or whatever, right? They're trying to
Love it or leave it.
they're trying to undermine the war, but there was not a notion that we were harming them. And now that's something that I find new in my lexicon and my political dictionary, that all of a sudden people claim to be hurt by speech when, um, you know, upset by it, yes. Agitated by it, yes. Provoked by it, yes. Hurt by it, maybe sometimes, occasionally, but I don't see it because words are words. I mean, words are very, very rich components in our life, right? They carry a big punch with them, but they're only words. In the end, they're words, right?
We make a distinction here between words and actions. It takes a hell of a lot to make a word into an action.
That's really the base of the First Amendment in a way, isn't it?
That's really, one of the cornerstones.
You really can, theoretically, you can really say anything unless you are inciting immediately to violence. Isn't that more or less the?
Basically, yes. And there's, I think people have always found there's certain words that in certain images that are almost toxic in their own right.
Right.
The N word, for one, we can't say it. I don't want to say it, but there it is. The swastikas, you can't use them at all in Germany.
I know.
Unless you have there's certain things that have become poisonous. There was a book called Only Words by Catherine McKinnon, the anti-porn, in which she said that pornography, not what it depicts, pornography itself is an assault on all women.
Right.
It's not what's going on the screen. And so we have come to say that the existence of these sentiments as expressed harms me. Okay, someone might feel harmed. I feel harmed in certain ways that you wouldn't, and vice versa.
Right.
The hitch that always comes is who decides,
right,
and for what reason, and who's affected by it. So if we're going to outlaw harmful speech, I'd love to have speech that hurts me go away. I just don't want someone deciding for me what, so I guess I have this distrust of authority, in particular distrust of authority as it comes to regulating what I'm going to hear or see.
Isn't it?
I just can't take it.
But I was thinking when some of social media had outlawed, say, or had deplatformed the Proud Boys and some of these neo-fascist organizations, my feeling was it wasn't a moral. I mean, there was a moral issue, but it was sublimated. I mean, yeah, I reacted more and saying, I don't think this is a good idea. It's a bad precedent. But in practical terms, it seemed to me, I mean, I'm really going to overstep here, but I'm going to see that, well, if they're really fascists and if they're really dangerous, well, then law enforcement should be able to track them. It's going to get a lot harder to track them when they're pushed underground. And also, forget about law enforcement. We have a right, I think. I would actually make it a right to know what they're thinking, what they're saying, what they're planning, what they're doing. And to push all this underground, say, I don't want to hear it, is, to me, almost self-defeating. I'd rather have...
Well, you also create martyrs. I mean,
right.
there's a industry of far-right politicians who carry their First Amendment, their free speech stripes. Look how I've been suppressed here. Look how I've been suppressed there. So, again, the difference between a word and an idea. Yeah, we've cleared to it. I was enormously relieved personally when Trump was taken off Twitter. I mean, honestly, it brought my blood pressure down. But at the same time,
you were morally opposed to
it. I was kind of opposed to it because maybe Trump's daily, lunacy drove a lot of people to vote against him. I mean, at least we know what was going on. It was very much Twitter's right to take them off. I'm not, and I liked it, but the better part of me maybe realizes that that wasn't the thing to do.
Well, you know what? We're going to leave it there because that's a great place to leave it. Eric
It
Berkowitz.
was a lot of fun, man.
And it's great. We'll do it again soon.
In a couple of weeks.
Hopefully. Eric's book is Dangerous Ideas, A Brief History of Censorship in the West, From the Ancients to Fake News. It's one of the best books I've read this year. I am a friend of Eric. I'll admit that. I'll confess to that, but I'm not going to lead you, the followers or the consumers of this, awry. It's a great book. Eric, thanks for